One of the reasons that I'm so interested in strategic sourcing for IT services companies is that it's really complex, right? Making good decisions about which vendors are going to supplement your internal team, those are decisions that require an understanding of both enterprise architecture and organizational design. So some quick definitions. Organizational design, of course, refers to all the decisions around the functions and the different teams and components of the business and how those different components are going to work in concert together to create business value. And enterprise architecture is the kind of the technology version of organizational design. What are the systems, how are the systems going to interact with each other, how are they going to support business objectives, that kind of thing. So strategic sourcing for IT services companies requires both of those components because the IT services companies probably use some kind of technology to deliver the service, and they probably have some kind of organization that supports the delivery of that service too. And both the technology and the teams within the vendor are going to interact with your technologies and with your teams, right? So if it's a puzzle piece, there's all kinds of knobs and bubbles and angles and notches and things to it, and they all have to fit pretty snugly together with your business in order to create the maximum business value. So when you're meeting with a new vendor, you have to decide or have to understand what's in the puzzle piece, what's included, right? What does this actually look like? And of course, you might be tempted to look at the services agreement as a way to understand that answer, right? The services agreement in theory describes all the different systems that will be used, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what are the premises that we use in designing the solution. Like that should be a pretty comprehensive list of what's included in the service. Now, in reality, it never quite works that way, right? Because technology services are usually pretty complex. If you really wrote a services agreement that covered every single aspect and every single decision that was being made, the thing would be 200 pages long, and it would put the vendor in a straitjacket. So they never were able to respond to any kind of changes or any needs that you might have that were unanticipated. So that's not going to quite work. The puzzle piece isn't just a contract, it's a relationship between a client and a vendor. And you have to understand that relationship from that organizational design and that enterprise architecture perspective in order to get it to work. So if we're talking about using enterprise architecture to make decisions about IT services companies, then you need to use the enterprise architecture standard model, which is of course TOGAF. TOGAF is a framework for making enterprise architecture changes. It's typically used by very large companies, right? Like multi-billion-dollar companies are going to use this to make decisions that are going to impact thousands of users and thousands of customers and billions of dollars in revenue. So arguably it is a little heavy. It's a process, it's documentation heavy, certainly. But maybe we can distill this down and just take the principles of TOGAF and then apply that to the decisions around IT services companies to make sure that you're making the best decision and that you're forming the puzzle piece in that relationship in a way that creates the best value for it. So there are 4 levels or 4 layers that you really need to consider when you think about TOGAF and when you think about enterprise architecture. The top layer is going to be the business architecture. So how does the business create value for its stakeholders, most notably its clients, right? What's the value chain look like? How do all the different components work together? What's the organizational design? All of those things fit within that top layer of TOGAF, and all those things have to be understood to some degree in order to make better decisions on lower layers that relate to specific vendors or technologies. So you might go through an exercise where you kind of map out the value chain from your suppliers all the way through to your client. You might go through an exercise to do a matrix that compares that value chain with the organization and how they're interacting together. Or if you're focused on a specific area or a specific application that you're fulfilling, you need to understand the requirements of all the stakeholders, why those requirements are important in context of the greater business case or the business objectives at the top level. And then once you have that understanding and that perspective, that should help you make better decisions about which vendor is going to create the most value for the company. The second layer underneath business is data. Companies need data about their clients, around their internal operations, around their suppliers, around their finances, around the entire extended enterprise in order to make the best decisions and in order to create the best value for all their stakeholders. So data is what supports all of those business requirements, especially with technology kinds of things, right? Because technology largely is about shipping around data and making great decisions on that data. So vendors, of course, relate to this data as well, because vendors are going to create data for you. They're going to interact with your data. They're going to have access to information that you have about the business. They're also, in some sense, going to insulate you from some data that could be quite critical, right? For example, if you have a help desk vendor that's coming in and is monitoring your end user experience, well, they have some really interesting data about the efficiency of your employees. If you have an outward-facing help desk company, well, they have really interesting information around the experience of your customers. So all that data needs to be accounted for, and you need to understand what data you're going to get from that vendor and how that data is going to be used to support those business objectives. Third layer, of course, is application. So applications generate data. Data supports business objectives, right? So by application, I mean things like features and functionality. So if you're actually choosing a real application, like an actual technology, you're probably thinking about the individual speeds and feeds, and I need this workflow to do that. I need this user to have this automatic kind of thing, like all of that built into it, right? The features and functionality. If you're choosing a service, however, you're probably thinking about all the features and functionality that are built into the service. So is there some kind of innovation fund put together? Is there some kind of like quarterly business review or some kind of way of making sure there's a continuous improvement cycle put in place? All of those features are going to fit into the application layer. So if you think about the business requirements, you think about the data that supports it, then you have to understand what application functionality is going to create that data and is going to maximize the value to the business on the top level. The final layer is technology. So technology is going to vary, of course, depending on what service the vendor is providing for me. So if it's outsourced, like an MSSP or a security provider, you're probably interested in what SIM tool they're using. If it's an outsourced network provider, it's probably the ITSM tool that they have in place, or maybe there's an automation for ticket handling or password reset or that kind of thing. So technology is going to be supportive of the application or the functions, the features that are built into the service, and that supports the data in the business and on upward. So how do you use TOGAF and enterprise architecture to make better decisions around which IT services companies you're going to let into your organization and to help fulfill your needs and create business value? In other words, how do you use TOGAF to shape and to select the right puzzle piece that fits into your puzzle? Well, in my experience, a large percentage, I'm not sure what it is, of agreements that fail between clients and vendors fail at the business requirements phase of strategic sourcing. In other words, the project was doomed to failure from the very beginning because of some kind of assumption that was untrue or some kind of misstep before the vendor was even engaged, right, at that level. Now, this can happen, of course, with the dreaded, here is a solution in search of a problem scenario. That's when someone gets really excited about the application layer, the features and functionality that comes through, but they're not really sure what business value it creates. That's one great example of that. But I've also seen examples where a vendor may come in and start working on a project and the client loses interest halfway through. Well, they only lose interest if it's not actually creating any business value for them, or if there's other things that are higher priorities for them. So if that's the case, then probably the project should never have been started to begin with, or the project should have been designed in a different way so that it created more business value and so it was more relevant and had a higher profile within the organization. So what I would recommend is before you have even that first conversation with the vendor, sit down with the team, put a whiteboard up, and start writing out what is the business requirements that we have, what's the business architecture, and how is that business architecture and those requirements going to shape our requirements for this vendor. And then go through the data. What is the data that we're going to need this vendor to pull out so we can use that to be more effective? Below that is the application layer. What features, functionalities, automations, whatnot do we need to have in place to get the best value and in order to generate the data that we need in order to create the business outcomes that we're looking for? And then finally, what's the technology that's going to create that application, that data, and that business outcome? Outline all of those things, and you might be surprised to discover that what you thought was important wasn't actually as important as you thought, or it doesn't tie directly to the business value or business outcome you're trying to create. It's an exercise that takes a couple of hours, maybe a couple of people in the room, and it's will save an immense amount of time in making sure you're not chasing a wild goose or engaging with a vendor that's not going to fit your requirements or making some other kind of misstep that may cause a problem for you 18 months down the road. So I've spent most of my career working on crafting these puzzle pieces and figuring out how to create great relationships between clients and vendors. I have a lot of experience and a lot of war stories around that kind of thing. I've spent the last year or so really digging into it though and developing this body of knowledge and this tool set for optimizing vendor relationships that are already in place or for designing these relationships through very thorough business requirements and needs analyses. And that's work that I think is really compelling for me and really exciting, and it's the focus of my company, Banyan Business Outcomes. So if you need help looking at a vendor or you're thinking about making a change, particularly around one of your IT services providers, then I would love to have a conversation with you about what your requirements look like and how to engage in a more thorough process that has a higher probability of success. Please reach out.